A lot of terrorism in the world, of course, is aimed at Israel, so it's not surprising, I suppose, that Israel finds ways of fighting back against terrorism. There's a group called Shurat HaDin, the Israel Law Center, which fights back against terrorism through the courts. They tend to try to track the sources of funding of terrorism. One of the lawyers who's involved with them is an Australian, Akiva Hamilton, also known as Andrew Hamilton, practiced as a solicitor in Australia, I believe, and is now with the Tel Aviv-based counter-terrorism group Shurat HaDin. He's been on a speaking tour of Australia, and he was made available to me, and I took up the opportunity to speak to him, and he joins me now. Good morning, Akiva.
Hi, Paul. How are you?
Very well, thanks, mate. Just explain to us the work that Shurat HaDin does.
Okay, well, Shurat HaDin was established a bit over a decade ago as a not-for-profit group on the model of the Alabama-based Southern Poverty Law Center, which had succeeded in bankrupting the Ku Klux Klan by bringing lawsuits against it. And so Nitsana Darshan-Leitner, who founded the organization, decided to apply the same model of bringing lawsuits against terror organizations, and particularly those that fund them and those that support them, as a way of harming the terrorist organizations. Shurat HaDin takes legal action on behalf of terror victims, mainly in the US courts, but other courts, and has won about $1.3 billion worth of judgments against Iran, Syria, the Palestinian Authority, and other organizations that have been involved in funding terrorism.
So just like, as in All the President's Men, you follow the dictum, follow the money.
Exactly. The reality of terrorism is that it's not just some person that decides to, strap on a suicide bomb and go murder people. There's an enormous amount of infrastructure and training and weapons and, bribing people to get people into place. A huge amount of money. And so if you follow the money, if you cut the money trail, you can dramatically cut terrorism.
See, I think many people would think that terrorism is so shadowy that there'd be no audit trails, that it works, in the shadows all the time. How could you possibly, get to them legally?
Yes, I understand. That's an interesting point. The interesting thing is that before the terrorist attack is perpetuated, yes, they keep it in the shadows, they don't want to be exposed. But once they've achieved what they consider a successful terrorist attack, murdering, Westerners, then they want to get credit for that, because terrorist organizations are not-for-profit organizations in a sense. They need to get money from their donors, and their donors are Iran and Syria and, elements in Saudi Arabia and those sorts of places. And they, in order to get money, they need to prove that they've actually achieved something. Iran funds on results, i.e. the more dead Westerners, the more dead Jews, the more money Iran gives. So they need to get results, and because they need to get credit after the attack has happened, it's not that hard at all to find out where the money came from.
And you've actually opened up the records of some, reasonably well-known banks, the Bank of China, the American Express Bank. How easy is it to get into banks legally?
Look, the example with the Bank of China case is that Israel had warned the Bank of China, through the intelligence services in Israel, that money was being funneled to, I think, Hamas. It warned them a number of times. The Bank of China did nothing about it, and then subsequently a terrorist attack resulted in which many people were murdered. And so that case is a case where the bank was put fully on notice about what was happening. And obviously, an organization like the Bank of China, they have operations in the United States, similarly with American Express, with other banks that transfer money. The banking system's all about transferring from one bank to another. Often these banks have been transferring money without being careful enough about where it's coming from.
Akiva, you've got an interesting case in point in Australia, which will surprise many people. It surprised me when I read the email about it. I should disclose at this stage that I'm a donor to World Vision, so I was really interested in the fact that you're actually wanting to open up World Vision because of some of the work that they're doing in the Middle East.
Exactly. Look, it's not just World Vision, it's Australian taxpayers' money. So you're not just a donor to it, I am too. Australian taxpayers' money from the foreign aid budget is being funneled through AusAid, Australia's aid agency, to World Vision to conduct work in the Gaza Strip. And World Vision, in doing that work, selected an organisation called the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. Now, very innocuous sounding name. The reality is that this organisation was established about 20 years ago by a terrorist group that's illegal under Australian law, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And this so-called charity, agricultural charity, the UAWC, has very close links to this terrorist group. It's so close, in fact, that the president, the vice president, and 3 of the directors of this so-called charity are senior terrorists in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That's on the 2009 directorship roles that we've got, which is the period. Australia's been funding this since about 2006, and continues to fund it to the tune of about $800,000 a year.
So has Shurat HaDin opened up the UAWC before?
Well, I raised this issue initially about a year ago, and
but I mean in its other operations, not necessarily ones funded by Australian and World Vision. Have they been on your radar previous to this?
No. This is something that's a relatively new project, and we did a lot of research and found that the UAWC cooperates very closely with the terrorist organisation. And in fact, I've got a great video of the president of the UAWC speaking at a Hamas rally in Ramallah, calling for the destruction of Israel, and introduced as a senior leader of the terrorist organisation, and he was the lead-in speaker for the leader of Hamas, who was arrested a few days later. So he's like, the lead-in act for the top terrorist in the region. And this is a guy that we've been funding. We've been funding his organisation for quite a number of years, and it's very concerning that Australia's taxpayers' money is going to an organisation with such dubious and concerning links to an illegal terrorist organisation.
So, Kiva, what does World Vision say when you raise with them the associations of this Union of Agricultural Work Committees?
Well, look, I must say World Vision's response has been really very disappointing. They say they care about, they don't want to fund terrorism, etc., but when you present them with the actual evidence, and I've sat across the table from Tim Costello at a meeting in Tel Aviv only a few months ago and gone through the evidence piece by piece, 37 separate pieces of evidence linking the organisation, linking the directors, linking the way it conducts things. Every time they can have they have a speaking engagement, a conference, they have speakers from this terrorist organisation. I went through all the different pieces of evidence, and Tim Costello's response, very disappointing. Well, his response was that we have to get our hands dirty to do aid work. I don't think that's an acceptable response for Australian taxpayers' funds.
It's the level to which you're prepared to get dirty.
Exactly. Look, their response has been that, they got some expert to say it was okay. We haven't seen the expert report, but we know that the expert is a radical left-wing person who's been completely discredited in Israel. So
the UAWC is said to be a registered charity. Registered by whom? Where?
Well, this is also false. And the Foreign Minister said this in Parliament, but it's completely false. The UAWC, the organisation that Australia has given millions and millions of dollars, is not registered as a charity in Israel. Not at all. It's a Palestinian organisation. It is not registered as a charity in Israel. What is registered as a charity is a completely separate organisation with a budget of 1/100th of the UAWC's that basically does nothing. That registration of a completely separate organisation has been handed around, laundered basically, as the registration for the UAWC. It's just false. The UAWC is not registered as a charity in Israel.
So you want to track this down legally? You want to take a legal action? What's the form of that?
Look, we're pursuing all means on this. We've been pursuing it through the media, we've been pursuing it through the political side, and we really feel that it's now time for the government to recognise that they were wrong on this, recognise that in a time of, budget pressure in Australia, that, if you're going to start cutting the aid budget or reducing the growth of it, you should start with the areas where it's dubious. And we're calling on the government to cut the funding for this organisation. There are other much more legitimate organisations that you can use to fund in Gaza if you have to, and we actually presented some to World Vision, but they didn't accept that either.
But will you pursue them legally?
Look, if it's not dealt with politically, then there are legal options. There is a law in Australia that says it's illegal. In fact, it's a criminal offence to directly or indirectly provide assets to a terrorist organisation. And our view is that it's certainly strongly arguable that if the charity organisation's controlled by terrorists and acts in concert with terrorists and was established by terrorists, then giving any money to it is indirectly giving money to a terrorist organisation. So that is an option, but that's criminal. That's a criminal case that would need to be brought, in a criminal standard. So that's one of the things we're looking at. The other issue is that we believe that World Vision has engaged in a lot of misleading and deceptive conduct that if they were a normal corporation, they would be able to be sued for. But unfortunately, charities in Australia are held to a much lower standard. You can't sue them under the Trade Practices Act or Australian competition law because they're not for profit. It's a bit disturbing that...
Could you pursue them internationally?
Yeah, well, there are options also in America. Certainly, you're much more able to take action. There's even stronger anti-terror laws in America, and it's possible to take action in America as well. But we're hoping that we're hoping that sanity prevails, and that this issue is solved at the government level where it really should be solved. Because I don't think anyone really wants to be funding a terrorist-linked organisation, but there's a real unwillingness to correct mistakes and to acknowledge that something's gone wrong here.
Great to talk to you. Thanks a lot, Akiva.